Are you ready to dive into the hard questions? Divine self-existence. The idea that God is self-existent is, well, it's a little hard to wrap your mind around. And so we looked at some passages of Scripture this morning, and we talked about it from Scripture, and we briefly described it, but we didn't really get down into the nitty-gritty. And honestly, even what we're going to do tonight is only scratching the surface of what can be said about this. In a nutshell, self-existence, which we could also call his independence or his self-sufficiency, or you want to learn a really fancy Latin-based term, his aseity. Okay? So we could call this God's independence, his self-sufficiency, or his aseity. Now, what is aseity? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the Latin for a se, which means to be by itself. Okay? So when we call self-existence aseity, we're accenting the fact that it's only him, existing by himself. When we say independence, we're thinking about, he is fully independent, doesn't need anyone to rely on. We are dependent, he's independent. And same thing with self-sufficiency, right? He's thoroughly self-sufficient. Thank you. And so God being self-sufficient or independent, those are kind of, similar ways of describing aseity. Or divine self-existence. The other thing that we'll want to say is that he's uncreated and that he's necessary, that he's a necessary being. He has to exist. That's what being a necessary being is. Everything else depends on God for its existence. But God's existence is a simple fact. Now, Thomas Oden puts it this way in Classic Christianity, a book on theology that I highly recommend. Even though I will say it's deep, it's complex. There's a lot going on there. But it is something that I refer to quite often when I'm preparing and doing studies. And the way that he articulates it is this: God minus the world is God. The world minus God is nothing. And we mentioned that this morning, but I want you to kind of think about that for a moment there in your head. God minus the world is God, and the world minus God is nothing. That is going to really get at the root of what it means for God to be self-existent. It also gets at the root of what it means for God to be the creator. Now, I have here God's self-existence in a way means that God simply is. We can relate his self-existence with the passage of Exodus 3:14 in the Old Testament. Now, what is Exodus 3:14? This is Moses meeting the Lord in the burning bush, okay? So if you got that picture in your head, okay, Moses he's out in the desert. There is a fire that is not consuming the bush, right? The bush is on fire, but it's not being consumed. And when Moses says, "Hey, who will I tell these folks sent me? What God are you?" Right? The King James Version says that the Lord responded, "I am that I am." Or the NIV, "I am who I am." And often this proclamation of "I am who I am" or "I am that I am" is taken to be God's proclamation of his self-existence. Some people will even translate it, "I will be who I will be." It's kind of like a tenseless application of who God is. We get the same thing kind of in the language of Isaiah and Revelation. The Lord is the one who was and is to come. And it's placing the idea of existing right there at the core of who God is. And when we place God's existence right there at the core of who God is, that He is existence, that's where that we're starting to get at this idea of self-existence, right? And so Exodus 3:14 seems to, kind of have this in there with a play on words also of the divine name. We often pronounce it Yahweh. Some folks pronounce it Jehovah, kind of taking it out of the German roots with the J sound being replaced for the Y sound there. But, this divine name, most folks, now I won't say this isn't contended by some scholars, but most folks see this as being rooted in the Hebrew word for to be, for the Hebrew word for existence. And so here we have I am that I am being a play on words off of the divine name. And so God's self-existence seems to be even rooted in the very name given for God through the Old Testament. Now, in addition to being self-existent, we also talked about God being necessary, right? He's a necessary being. Let's talk about that a little bit. So if God is a necessary being, let's put this in the negative. In the negative, that means that God cannot not exist. And when I say that, I mean that in the most serious way possible. And I know some people, want to say, well, God can do whatever He wants. If you take this very seriously, God can't stop existing. He simply exists. You take it seriously, there's no such thing as divine suicide. It's not within His nature. His nature is to exist. And so, taken seriously, if He is necessary, He cannot not exist. There is no possible world in which He does not exist. Now, on the other side, so God cannot not exist. Additionally, He never came into being, and He can never go out of being. So I want to say that before I get to the other side there. He never came into being, and He'll never go out of being. All right. In order to kind of see what that is, now let's compare that to the other side of the equation, okay? We are what's called contingent beings. A contingency plan is what you do if, right? There's something going on and your contingency plan is provided that this thing happens, then I'm going to do this, right? So things that are contingent rely on something else. The contingency plan's only used if something else, in event of this contingency, right? So a contingent thing relies on something else. And so we are contingent beings. We rely on Him for our existence. Because God has existed both with and without creation, and we talked about that, and we talked about using that instead of a idea of saying that God, the Scripture says that He existed before all time, and I think that that's a very eloquent way of saying this that we find in the Scripture in Jude chapter 1:25. There's only one chapter in Jude, by the way. So we find this idea of God being before time, but if you really think about it and you press the language, before is a temporal word. And so I want you to think about God, and this will help later on, as existing, yes, before time, but the idea of being before time being God existing without time and God existing with time. And that kind of goes back to that principle again that we're going to return to over and over again when we think about this and when we think about God's eternity. God minus the world is God. But the world minus God is nothing. And so here we have God with and God without creation. But you can't have creation without God. And so there is a logical order, but it's not necessarily a temporal order. Now, with that being said, there's an additional part of this, not just thinking about God's existing alone, that we also get. That means that He does not rely on creation. And so if He does not rely on creation and creation relies on Him, we can say with full behind it the words of Acts. And when Paul is preaching, he's preaching in Athens, and he tells them in Acts 17:25 that God is not served by human hands as if He needed anything. And so if God is completely self-existent, completely self-sufficient, completely independent, that makes a lot of sense. He can be served by human hands, but not as if He needed anything. All right? And so, now, notice the caveat that we gave, and like I told you before when we were going to talk about these theological things, a lot of these come with caveats, but the caveats actually seem to make God greater, not lesser, right? The caveat is that, well, He did exist, so why are we here if He doesn't need us, right? That's not the caveat itself, but that's kind of the thing that brings the caveat to light. Like, God exists, He's got everything He needs within Himself, so why even create? Well, that means that creating was somehow to Him better than not creating. So, although we can't serve Him as if He needed anything, we are able to glorify Him, to bring Him glory. It's not that He needs the glory, but it's that the glory is something that He decided that whatever we do to glorify Him was better than not having us. And so that gives us purpose. It gives us a reason. It gives us, it provides a meaning, really, to everything in a way that that if we don't have God as that foundation, things very quickly become meaningless. And so God's self-existence and then His choice to bring in creation as the Creator really ends up being our source of finding out what our meaning is. And when we try to look for our meaning outside of God, we find that the only things that we can find meaning in are contingent on Him anyway. And so He's the only source of true meaning for us. So any search for meaning that doesn't end in God and His purpose for us is going to be utterly futile. And so we can glorify God, but He doesn't need it. So thus, God's self-existence implies His independence and His sufficiency. So He doesn't need us to glorify Him. He's completely independent. His self-existence implies that independence, but because He's chosen to create us, we then have meaning in whatever He's given us, and that's where that we should seek out that meaning. Now, next, He's an independent being, but we're dependent beings. So with us being dependent beings, that means that He gives everyone breath and life and everything else. That comes from Acts. He's the creator and the sustainer. And so in a very real way, classic Christianity has held, and I think this is right, that were God to stop sustaining the world and being, it would simply stop existing. And that goes right back again to that statement that I pulled out of Odom. God minus the world is God. The world minus God is nothing. And so here we have a way even in which we could say that God sustains the world and being. Were God to not exist suddenly, which I don't think could happen out of the very nature of Him being a necessary being, but if that were to happen, if we say, well, maybe Chris, you're wrong, then it seems very fitting that everything would go away. And so that's the idea of God being the sustainer. All right, now the next part that I want to look at here is that all three persons are self-evident, and we covered that this morning too. Denial of Christ's self-existence. Now, I haven't really seen many folks try to go and deny the Holy Spirit's self-existence. It seems that if the Holy Spirit is believed in, the Holy Spirit's self-existence kind of is if the Father and the Spirit and the Son are all believed in, it seems natural to most folks to think about all of them as self-existent, except for some reason Christ just gets thrown under the bus over and over and over and over again. And that's really sad. Some instances, for example, hallmarks of this. In Mormonism and in the Jehovah's Witnesses religion, Christ's deity is stripped from him. He becomes a created being. And so I think it's important for us to realize that classically all three persons of the one God are held to be self-existent. And so one thing that some proof for this, for example, is that in Genesis 2, right there, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, right? Very next verse, the Spirit of the Lord is hovering over the water. You go to John 1:1 and you can see the role of Jesus Christ in the creation as being the one through whom the world is created. I've got a note there, by the way, in your notes, if you're interested in looking more at this, especially if you're interested in talking with folks who do deny the deity of Christ, who deny this, there's a really good argument that has been put together by a man named Greg Kokel based off of John, the Gospel of John 1 verse 3. And he uses 1:3 instead of 1:1 very tactically because some of these folks have got their translation and they're only going to use their translation. And so he attempts to use the Watchtower Association's translation, the Jehovah's Witnesses translation, ends up being problematic for these verses. But it's not problematic for 1 verse 3. And so very specifically he picked that out for dealing with Christian cults. And realize when I say Christian cults, I don't mean that derivatively. That's not that's not to say something bad by using the word cult. We hear cult and we think, okay, everybody's going to drink the funny Kool-Aid and die. That's not what I mean when I say cult. In a very real sense, Christianity came out of Judaism and could be considered a cult of Judaism, right? Because Judaism was the primary religion of the time, and Christianity raised up out of that, but it obviously doesn't believe the same things that Judaism today believes. And so, I wouldn't qualm too much with that. I think that we're holding the true religion that extends from the Old Testament to the New Testament, but in that sense, you could even say that Christianity today is a cult. So this isn't a negative term; it's just a term being used to say that here's a parent religion or a religion that exists, and then the cult is the religion that comes out of it and understands the religion differently. And so for example, the Mormon religion and the Jehovah's Witness religion tries to take our roots, but they try to understand it differently. And so I wouldn't call them Christian, because I think that they've understood it so differently that they're not understanding it like Christians understand it. And so anyway, I think it's very important that we hold that the three persons of the Trinity are also self-existent. Now, finally, what I want to do is get you to take some time to look at the chart on the back of the first page you've got there. The difference between God and creation, because if you're going to think about divine aseity or divine self-existence, I think that it's helpful to see it in contrast. That necessary, God being a necessary being, is as opposed to Him being a contingent being like we are. Him being uncreated is as opposed to Him being created like we are. Him being independent is as opposed to us who are dependent. And so a lot of the times I think that this particular aspect of God, which we talked about the infinite attributes of God being the ones where that He's not like us, and so this one I think seems to be utterly infinite and not personal. The personal attributes of God we talked about being the ones that He gives to us through His image, right? This one the only thing I can see is maybe some of us, seem to have stuff together enough that we appear to have some semblance of independence, but I mean, it's really not. Because anybody, I mean, kind of as you've probably seen over the years of life and observing, anybody who thinks that they're really independent has got another thing coming to them. We all face trials. We all face illnesses that we can't handle alone. We all face trials we can't handle alone. We all eventually face physical death that we cannot prevent. We are not independent. He is. Now, finally, the next thing that I wanted to point out before we go into doing some exercises together is that God's self-existence is really strongly related to His creation, and you've probably already picked up on that by the way we've been talking about it. God's self-existence really relates to a Christian doctrine called creatio ex nihilo. So there's some Latin for you. Creatio ex nihilo. What does creatio ex nihilo mean? It means creation out of nothing. All right? So it has been held in the classical Christian faith, the Christian faith, through the ages, has held that God created the world out of nothing. Perhaps you've heard the illustration of the man who decides that he's going to create, and that he's, usually we put a scientist in there because, we always try to draw that big dichotomy, religion and science. I don't think that's a good idea. I think that they work together really well when they're both properly understood. But anyway, you usually kind of have this, scientist who he's going to create like God has. He's going to, create something. He's going to create his own world. And, the way that the story goes is, he's going to create his own human being maybe, and he goes and he gets his dust and he gathers up his dust and he gets ready to start seeing how he can go from dust to a human being. And God looks at him and says, well, excuse me, you're going to have to get your own dust. That's mine, And so there ends up being this problem of all of the things that we're able to do. We have to start with something He's got, that He's given us, right? We want to create life from non-life, and we try to do it with dust, but, He did it without any dust, right? He makes the dust first. And so creatio ex nihilo holds that God created with nothing, that He literally brought creation into being, that there was no creation and there was creation. And so that's the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo. It avoids a problem that was happening, that's happened, early on, things that were considered heresy in the church, were, for example, that creation itself was co-eternal with God. And so you might have heard, probably not, but some folks who have tried to reinterpret the Genesis passage say, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that's the title. And then it begins with the earth being formless and void and God. And so you've got two eternal things, the earth and then God forms the earth. And that really ends up being a dualistic picture that's not Christian. Because in the Christian worldview, God brings the earth into existence. You don't have some kind of eternal matter and God, because then you, in a sense, kind of get two gods. You see the problem there? We'll kind of talk about that a little bit as we'll broach something similar to it when we get into some of these other pieces of today's lesson. So what we end up having then, out of creatio ex nihilo, is the idea that, God and then creation. Now, what I'm going to have us do here in a moment is we're going to look at some cosmological arguments. Now, what are cosmological arguments? They're arguments from existence, from things that exist back to God, from His creation to Him. There are ways in which we can see creation and imply from it that there is a God. It basically is part of that question, why is there something rather than nothing? And I think that that's a really good question to ask anyone who is not a believer, and anyone who has questions about the existence of God. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because I think that question can only be answered by the existence of a creator. And not only by the existence of a creator, but a creator who very much resembles the God taught about in the Scriptures. And so, in order to kind of get into that and to work with that, and now it's time to really get your brains going, I'm sorry. Your mind's going to have to move that brain there in your body, and it's going to have to twist it and turn it and get everything firing. And I'll tell you right now, I'm not firing on all cylinders. Today's been a long day, and I'm sure it's been a long day for a lot of you too, but we're going to try to work with this a little bit. So to start out, what I want you to do is read that paragraph that is indented there on page 8. This actually comes from William Lane Craig's Defenders class, which I find very helpful on these topics. And what I want you to do is read that paragraph where that he describes kind of the nuts and bolts of a cosmological argument without actually giving it an argument form. So read that, talk about it with your neighbor, talk about what sort of things it makes you think. Well, let's come back together and talk about this a little bit. So, okay. How many of you would have been the hiker who'd said, no, let's just keep going? It does not matter to me one bit. Who cares that there is this translucent ball out here in our hiking path? I am out here for some exercise. Let's not worry about it. Yeah. People who go through life with existence itself going, you know what, let's just not worry about it. You ever go through life yourself going, okay, let's just not worry about it, right? But now let's start thinking about it. So what do you think? Do we need an explanation for why there's, some translucent ball-shaped object hanging out in the woods? Is it just there inexplicably? You don't seem, how many of you would buy the answer that, well, it's just there. There's no reason. It's just there. Does that sound right? That doesn't sound right, does it? Now, what about his talk about the size of it? Does it matter how big or small it is? It's still just kind of not right. Do you see that? Now, what about the world itself? Do you see how it runs into the same kind of, why is this here? What about the whole universe? Why is this here? It seems to beg an explanation, doesn't it? It doesn't seem to have within itself what is needed to explain itself. And that's kind of why we looked at that there. It doesn't seem to have within itself what is needed to explain itself. So there's kind of the example there. Are there any questions on the little passage that we just read there? Does that help you see the difference between necessary and contingent? The ball in the example would be what kind of being? A necessary being or a contingent being? It'd be contingent, right? You may not know why it's there, and you may not be able to explain all the contingencies, but by golly, you don't think that it just popped into existence uncaused out of nothing, do you? That just doesn't seem to be the right explanation. Interestingly enough, some folks have proposed that the universe popped into existence uncaused out of nothing. And I think that seems to have the same kind of problems. And so what I'm going to do right now is basically take you through some arguments, and we're just going to kind of run through these. We're really only going to scratch the surface, and I'm sorry, we're not even going to, you might leave here being pretty confused about the arguments, and I'll tell you part of that is, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit more tired than I expected to be while I was explaining this, because I really do get excited about these, but and I am. This is going to be a lot of fun, but at the same time, I'm sorry if I'm not firing on all cylinders while we do this, okay? So The argument from contingency, the argument that I've got here comes from a wonderful volume that I've got on philosophy and religion. I think Reason and Religious Belief or something like that is the name of it. And so it goes like this. And the way that we look at arguments, by the way, I should mention this before we get into it. This is not bickering, okay? That's not what we're doing here. This is not the kind of argument we're looking at. We're not talking about a fight, okay? We're not talking about the kind of argument you might have had before you got here with your spouse. That's not the kind of argument I'm talking about. I'm talking about an argument where that you lay out the facts and the premises and you try to come to a conclusion, right? This is a reasoned argument, not a fight. Further, when we use arguments with folks who don't agree with us, not all good arguments win the day, okay? Sometimes a really good argument just doesn't convince someone. And sometimes the better thing for an argument to do is not necessarily convince someone, but to, what we might say, put a stone in their shoe, get them thinking about it. We don't want to turn a reasoned argument into a fight. Instead, our argument may well be rejected by them, but as they leave, if they've got something to think about that they haven't had to think about before, the argument might produce fruit that we don't see. So it's not about being argumentative, it's about giving people something to think about. Because most folks aren't going to change their mind in front of you. And if you insist that they do, they're probably going to bow up and never change their mind. Or be very objectionable to changing their mind. Where they may have changed their mind pretty easily on their own later, if you press the point and press the point and press the point, now they've got a vendetta against you, right? They are not going to change their mind. Now it's become emotional. And so I don't think we should use arguments in that way either. But I do think that they're very helpful for us to understand things as we look through the premises and come to the conclusion. And I do think that they're even helpful for us to share with folks so long as we share them properly and not in that fight mode, but instead in a let's reason and talk together. Let the other person talk. That's important too. Because if you're the only person who gets to talk, they're not going to enjoy that conversation, and they're going to feel like they're being bullied. Okay, an argument from contingency. A contingent being exists. All right, so do we have any examples of this first premise? Can you think of a contingent being that exists or a contingent thing that exists? No? Yeah, me, the pew, So that seems to be true, right? A contingent being exists. Number two, this contingent being has a cause or an explanation for its existence. With us, we might think back to mom and dad. With the pen, we might think to the manufacturer and the raw materials that made the ink and everything else, right? Same thing with the pew. So this contingent being has a cause or an explanation for its existence. Awesome. Number three, the cause or explanation for its existence is something other than the contingent being itself. That's kind of part of the nature of something being contingent, right? The pen didn't make itself, did it? We didn't make ourselves. So the cause or the explanation of a contingent being is something other than itself. And this really goes to a basic intuition that we kind of all have and that we've probably learned through school, the law of cause and effect, right? You have a cause and you have an effect. And that effect might provide another cause and another effect, and you kind of get the domino chain going, right? And so each cause has an effect. Now, number four, what causes or explains the existence of this contingent being must be either other contingent beings or include a non-contingent, In other words, a necessary being. And so, when we start to think about why something's here, we can either relate it to another thing that needs explaining, and another thing that needs explaining, or we can relate it to something that doesn't need explaining, that has within itself its own explanation. That would be a necessary being. And number 5, therefore, what causes or explains the existence of this contingent being must include a non-contingent being. And finally, therefore, a necessary being exists. Okay. Questions? What have you got? Are you tracking with me? Any objection? You see any problem with the argument? Now, what about this? What if we said, well, there's an infinite number of contingent beings? Would that make the argument false? You see where I'm going? Let's say that, the pen has a manufacturer, and they got the materials from the ground, and the ground and everything else that kind of got that together is part of the cycle of life. And because the cycle of life has kind of always existed and matter doesn't, can't be destroyed and things like that, the materials have always been around. And so there's just kind of always been a reason for everything. It's just each reason has another explanation, the thing before it. And so you just get an infinity of reasons. Do you think how does that sound to you? Now, I think the problem there, because some people are going to try to do this, you have a thing, and then it's explained by the thing before it, and it's explained by the thing before it, and it's explained by the thing before it. And you get to the point where that you say, well, if you just assume an infinite past, then you never have to actually get to the explanation, right? Do you see that? Now we're left with the set of all things not having an explanation. So even if you have an infinite regress of explanations, that set is left unexplained. Am I making sense there? Therefore, a necessary being exists. Okay, we're going to put that one kind of in the background. And now we're going to look at a second one called the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, William Lane Craig is a really big proponent of this, and I really encourage you, if you want to understand this more, to look at his material. Go to his website, do some searching on it, purchase maybe his On Guard study or something like that really goes into the details of it, because we're only going to barely scratch the surface, just like we did on the other one. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. And that premise really just seems to kind of naturally be the case, right? Everything that begins to exist seems to need a cause for its existence. It seems to need some reason why it starts, right? So everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Number 2, the universe began to exist. Now, Christian teaching has always been that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So there's a beginning. In Christian teaching, we teach that there was a beginning. Now, for a long time, people thought, who weren't Christian, that there wasn't a beginning, that the past was actually infinite. Until recently, I say recently somewhat, but how many of you know or have, about the change in science called the Big Bang Theory, right? Okay, so the Big Bang Theory is a now scientifically, it's the standard in in cosmology? Yeah, it's the standard model in cosmology, yes. Yeah, it's the standard understanding of how the universe came about, from a scientific perspective. And so this idea that's called the Big Bang theory, which actually, it being called the Big Bang theory really came from folks making fun of it in the beginning. I can't remember the whole story, but I kind of find that interesting. We call it the Big Bang theory without thinking of it that way. They called it the Big Bang theory because, yeah, bang, and then there was the universe. That's kind of the joke behind that there. But the Big Bang theory is now the standard model used in understanding of how these things came about. Now, I want you to realize, and I myself, I really don't have a problem with the Big Bang theory. I think that seems to me to make a lot of sense of how some of that comes about. But even if you don't, even if you insist on another model for the world coming into being, this is a way to relate to there being a finite amount of time, right? It goes back to a beginning. So whether you're looking at young Earth creation, which dates the world anywhere from 5,700 or something like that, somewhere around 6,000 years old, to Big Bang cosmology, that gives a date that's somewhere close to 13.8 billion, right? Either direction, no matter which one you're holding to, you've got to get to a beginning point, right? Both ideas hold to a beginning point. And so this seems to be a scientific proof of number two here in the Clom argument, that the universe began to exist. Now, in addition to using something like Big Bang cosmology, there's another scientific proof that we could look at, and that is not only does the universe have a beginning according to the reigning model, but the universe will also eventually die a heat death according to the second law of thermodynamics. Now, this would be either, there's some models of the Big Bang theory that are oscillating, that say that there's a Big Bang and then there's a big crunch. Now, I realize bang is don't think of it as an explosion. It's better to think of it almost kind of as a balloon blowing up and coming down, because everything's receding from each other and coming back to each other. You're going from a point of infinite density out and back to a point of infinite density if you believe in the models that go into a crunch, an oscillating universe. But either way, the prevailing scientific theories look at this ending either in a state of everything finally just running apart into which there's no energy left and just exhausting itself, or it coming back to a form of infinite density and not ever being able to go out again. And so not only do we have within this a beginning, we also have an end to the physical universe kind of being proposed there with the Big Bang theory. Now, what does this do? Well, it kind of goes against any intuition that you could have an eternal beginning if you've got an end. Do you see that? And so those are two scientific arguments that kind of go to this intuition of the universe beginning to exist. Because if it had an eternal past, it would never stop existing because there's an eternity there. Now, there's also some philosophical reasons to believe that there can't be an infinite number of things. And so the argument goes this wise, 2.1, an actual infinity cannot exist. And so let me talk about that with you for a little bit, because that's probably something you've never thought about before, as to whether or not an actual infinity can exist. So we're going to do a little bit of a thought experiment, okay? So ladies, family's coming over for the holidays, and your relatives are going to come see you. And it just so happens that on your side of the family, you have an infinite number of relatives. And it's time to bake cookies. Scary, right? So you've got an infinite number of relatives coming to visit, and it's time to bake cookies for them. Now, the infinite number of relatives would be an actual infinity. How many of you are familiar with, you've probably thought of infinity before, with the lazy 8 symbol, right? Something kind of like this. You see that there? You know, that being an infinity. But an actual infinity is not represented thus-wise. It's represented by the Hebrew letter Aleph. Well, that's probably, you probably can't see my Aleph very well from there, but it's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. That's an actual infinity. So there's a difference between what's called an actual infinity and a potential infinity. Okay, so let's say you have an actual infinite number of relatives that are going to show up, right? Altogether, they're going to show up and you need to bake cookies for them. And let's say that your oven is you've got an easy bake oven, so you only get to do one at a time, okay? So a potential infinite is going to be all that you're going to be able to come up with if you're able to put one cookie in at a time and then take it out and then put another cookie out. And so a potential infinite is that you never run out of materials and you keep baking cookies trying to get to infinity. But no matter how many cookies you make, you're never going to get to infinity, because by adding one each time, there's always going to be more to get to infinity. And so it's going to be infinitely distant from you. Now notice this really doesn't change. Say you've got a nice big oven that you can cook 100 cookies in at a time. Even if you bring them out in hundreds, even by adding the hundreds, you're not going to get there. In fact, even if you could add the cookies in by the billions, by adding numbers successively to each other, you're never going to actually get to infinity. Provided you're always able to do this, you're going to have a potentially infinite number of cookies, but you're never going to be able to feed everyone. Okay, so there's a problem. Well, let's fix that problem by giving you a magic cookie jar that's got an actually infinite number of cookies in it. And it's got a nice big infinite rim so everybody can reach down in and grab a cookie at the same time. Okay? So you've got your magic cookie jar that's got an infinite number of cookies, and they all show up and they take out a cookie. And now you've fed an infinite number of relatives with an infinite number of cookies because the cookies are already there. But what if he's got an infinite number of relatives too and they're coming? Interestingly enough, we lay out the cookies in a row and we have everybody pick up only the even-numbered cookies. The number of even-numbered cookies in an infinity is infinity. So they could pick up all of the even-numbered cookies, and then the family from the other side could come and pick up all the odd-numbered cookies, and they're still all fed. All this to say that an infinite number of actual things is impossible. An infinitely old universe would imply an infinite number of durations of time that are finite, hence would be an actual infinity and wouldn't be possible. Now that pretty much works you through 1, 2, and 3 there for argument 2. And then finally, if that's the case, that everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence, and that the universe began to exist, we must therefore come to the conclusion that the universe has a cause for its existence. Questions? Okay, I know that this got really, really thick really quick, and what I want to leave you with is something a little less thick than that, even though it's going to still be kind of thought-provoking. If this is the case, if creation itself cries out for an explanation, if the fact that we exist seems to imply that that can't be explained and that we need an explanation that goes beyond simple contingent beings like ourselves, then it also seems that whatever preceded existence itself has got to be timeless. It seems that whatever began existence has to transcend the universe itself. And then third, it seems that whatever began the creation, whatever began existence, is not the result of something else happening. So there are two kinds of causations. There is event causation, in which one event causes another, and then that other event has to cause another. And then two, there's something called agent causation. Now, what is agent causation? You see it every day because you have free will. And when you decide to do something, it is not because something else has forced you to do it. It's because you have willed to do it. You've engaged in agent causation. Agent causation is the property of persons. And so whatever began the universe that was timeless and immaterial and changeless had agent causation, which meant that they were personal. And so by knowing that there has to be a reason for existence, we also know that the only thing sufficient to be a reason for our existence needs to be a personal being, a necessary being and a personal being. It needs to be unimaginably powerful. It would make sense that that being is all-knowing. In fact, it makes a lot of sense that that being that created the universe would have the classical characteristics ascribed to the Christian God. Are there any questions? By the way, I forgot to give you the colloquial version of the Big Bang stuff, and I've got it written down here. Reminders from my wife to make Chris sound more simple and to not get you lost in all of his strange thoughts on these things. You might say a Big Bang needs a Big Bang-er. You got to have someone to get it all started. All right, will you pray with me? Father, we thank you for who you are. We thank you that we can rely on the everlasting arms of our Creator, who brought us into being, but is himself uncreated and